I always like joke that like I was forced into my profession, my career.
Yeah.
So I like had chronic gut issues growing up. Like I would get sick all the time. And like I'm talking like could not eat at a fast food restaurant without getting sick.
Really?
And like a lot of other things too, but that's like one of the ones that comes to mind that me and my family like joke about. And I think for me, a lot of it, of my gut issues at that time connected to anxiousness that neither me or my family identified as anxiousness. So
were you a really anxious kid?
I was a really like fearful kid. So we would, you know, if we were like getting on a plane, I all of a sudden would like look at my parents and be like, I'm gonna be sick. And they believed me because I did get sick so often. But a lot of times in that situation, they'd be like, listen, Abby, we're still gonna get on the plane. Like we're going on vacation, like talk me through it. And like it would, you know, resolve itself. So there was kind of that like, I don't think I could separate when it was like my mind causing the physical reaction and when I was actually having a physical reaction.
Oh,
does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think that like obviously those issues continued into playing college sports, which is where I really started making changes and realizing how much like diet and gut health could play a role in kind of all the experiences that I was having. But I definitely like learned very early on that I had to be careful to an extent just because of that experience.
Yeah. Do you still, so when you talk about being more like fearful than necessarily anxious, do you still sort of have to regulate that? Like do you still get, because I feel like that could, I feel like a lot of that can like trickle into adulthood, you know?
Yeah, so I definitely like credit my parents a lot with this, is that whenever I had that like experience, they never were like, okay, we're not doing a thing. Like they definitely like, I mean, I'm sure there's probably some cons to this too, but they definitely like talked me through it and like were like, this is what we're doing, like we're gonna get through it together, and I would always be fine. Yeah. You know, like I would always like work through it. And I also, something that's like come up a lot recently for me was that I kind of like learned how to self-regulate in both of those situations like pretty early. Yeah. I like noticed when I was younger and I was feeling really sick and thought I was gonna throw up, that if I took really deep breaths, the feeling would go away. Yeah. And like
our body knows exactly what it needs. It always has.
And so like that was something that I kind of like forgot for a lot of years, and then more recently I was like, wait, like that's so cool that like at that young age I was like, oh, I noticed that this is making me feel better. So that was something that started with like being like feeling like I'm gonna get sick, but then kind of trickled into using it for like anxious feelings or kind of like calming and regulating in that situation too. So yeah.
So it hasn't, So it hasn't been like too much, like you've learned how to, like the regulation has always sort of been like a consistent thing that you've practiced.
Or I wouldn't say like consistent or like conscious.
Yeah, not like, but like it's been there.
It's been there. Like like some awareness has been there, but I wouldn't say that like that tendency or like natural like part of my personality has completely gone away, if that makes sense.
Right. And then going into when you were playing soccer, was the struggle you were having more from, well, I guess when people have gut health issues, is it generally coming more from what they're experiencing and thinking, or from the foods that they're eating, would you say?
I think it happens kind of like on a spectrum, so different percentages for different people,
that
right?
Would make sense.
Like there's some people that like if you have chronic anxiety, like that's going to affect your gut. But there's also some people, like if you have like a severe food intolerance, or if you were struggling with like imbalances in your gut microbiome, that can 100% affect your mental health as well. For me, it was definitely, I would say, a combination, and it always has been. I think at that time, I started making changes just because I wasn't feeling good about my performance. I wasn't feeling good in my body. I wasn't you know, I was like, I'm exercising all the time. Like, I should feel good, and I didn't.
Yeah.
And so my change was definitely physical first, but that was like a connection that I built very early on, because once I started eating foods that made me feel good, working on my gut health, like my GPA went up like a whole point. Like my coaches were like, what are you doing? Like,
really?
It was a very like stark difference. And from there, I like kind of noted like, okay, this is how much our physical health can play into our mental health, our performance, the way we move through the world. And so that's always been something that like I'm really passionate about, is like telling people like, this isn't just like how you feel or just dealing with like bloating. This is like it's affecting every area of your life. So that's why I'm so like passionate about nutrition, is because it really does have that like overarching effect.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because it was a similar thing for me, where it was I always ate horrifically. I was like the house that everybody wanted to go to, because we had like the good snacks. Like we were that house. Like we had the most processed, delicious, horrible food in our pantry.
I love it.
And like I lived off frozen burritos, and like it wasn't until, because I didn't play basketball my senior year of high school, and so I got into modeling and acting, and it wasn't until then where I was like, well, maybe I should eat like not frozen burritos. And it was crazy, because it's so simple. It was such a simple switch, and it would just be you'd think it would just be common sense of like, we shouldn't live off of Oreos.
Yeah.
But it was just like, it completely changed the way I feel, and that's why I've been like so serious since then of like cooking my meals. Because as someone that's also had a lot of struggles with anxiety, like if I don't, I can feel the difference immediately. Yeah. And so, okay, going into, it's cool that your sort of switch happened in your early 20s, considering that is who the majority of my audience is, like late teens, early 20s. Obviously you were looking into it in college, but what would you, knowing what you know now, what would you have told that Abby as far as like gut health, mental health, or just a piece of advice that you feel like specifically like high school, college students would need to know?
I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is like looking at food as fuel, as energy, instead of like, I think many of us are introduced to even thinking about nutrition at all in the lens of dieting. Whether that's parents or social media or friends, whatever, we all experience it in that way in some way or another. And I think that it's usually framed in like this sense of like, you're doing something wrong, something's wrong with your body, you need to like, you need to do this to fit in. But really, like, nutrition can do so much more for us. And especially like in that situation, if you're not eating enough, like you're not going to be the best version of you. You're not going to be able to like move through the world in a positive way, in a positive light, and it's definitely going to contribute to mental health. So I would say that's like the biggest thing that I wish I knew, because sure, when I started, it was some concern for like performance and not feeling good, but there was definitely some like, oh, I don't like the way my body looks right now.
I was the same way. I was a model. Like,
so I'm sure you
experienced
that in the extreme.
And it sucks. Like, it's such a crappy feeling. And I wish like that. Like, it almost makes me want to cry. Like, hearing you say, what was the wording you used? not only seeing it as fuel, but I'm trying to remember what you said. I liked it.
I don't even know.
There's nothing, like, we phrase it as like something's wrong and my body's, there's something wrong with my body, and there's something wrong with the way that my body functions and the way that it works. And I haven't really heard nutrition and phrased in that way, because I say that all the time as someone that's like teaching emotional skills, and where I'm like, your anxiety is not bad. What you think are bad emotions are not bad emotions. Like, your body is very intelligent and is sending you cues. And so to hear nutrition and gut health phrased in that way, because I've been having a lot of issues in that realm right now. And I feel like that's the headspace I've been in, where I'm like, what's wrong with me? When really, if I was just have a little more empathy and be like, what is she trying to tell me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's huge. And it's hard to make changes from that negative headspace. You know? Like, like, because then you're kind of always in this like mindset of like, oh, I'm fixing myself.
Yep.
And instead of supporting myself, you know, instead of like
loving myself.
Exactly.
Like trying to hate yourself into better gut health. Like, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not really the way to go about it.
Definitely not.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really like that, because that's going to stick with me with what's going on. Because I've been having I got off like an antidepressant. I've talked to my audience about that quite a bit.
Okay.
I did a podcast recording on that, and I've made some videos where people were like, me too. And so it's like, I think it's really thrown my gut out of whack.
I would imagine.
And it's not great.
Yeah.
It's not great.
Yeah. I mean, a big readjustment, especially with, was it an SSRI? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's going to affect, I mean, your gut a lot. 95% of our serotonin is made in the gut.
Yes.
So, like, I know kind of the mechanism behind that, and I can only imagine how that would affect.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it is very comforting, just like because of that. I feel like I've really been in the headspace of like, why can't my body just like do what it's supposed to do? But I think, just like with emotions, like coming from a place of empathy, or even like, because I struggled with an eating disorder, and being able to go a route of empathy as opposed to like, I need to fix myself. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, I think we can get really embarrassed of our shortcomings.
Yes.
And it just makes it so much harder.
Yes.
It's so much harder.
It's a struggle, but it's a battle. And
it's
just, it's.
Yeah. So, okay. Was there anything else I wanted to ask you as far as... Yeah, I think I'll switch gears a little bit. So to get into like sort of the nitty gritty of it a little bit more, I think just like as a basis, and I know you've had to answer this question many, many times, but like, can you give just like a basic understanding of how the gut is connected to the mind?
Yeah. So, we'll stick like specifically to how the gut's affecting the brain, not as much the other way, or do you want
maybe
kind of
both?
Okay.
If you can.
Yeah, so we'll start with the gut. So kind of a lot of things here. But essentially there is cells in like near the lining of our gut that are connected to our brain and send certain signals depending on what's going on in the gut microbiome. So a lot of that can have to do with different neurotransmitters like serotonin and things like that. Right. And so based on kind of that state, that homeostasis of our gut, we can get different signals. And so for example, like if someone will do leaky gut first, because a lot of people have heard of that, right? So if you're dealing with like excess levels of inflammation in your gut lining, or certain bacteria that maybe aren't supposed to be in as high of levels in your gut are overgrowing, that can basically affect the signals being sent to your brain and therefore affect your mental health. So
Right.
even with different things like IBS and SIBO, they've been correlated with higher rates of things like anxiety and depression.
Which would, makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's like just an easy kind of example of like, okay, this is real. Like they've seen it in studies and science.
Yes,
How
yeah.
much this correlates. And then a lot of it too with like the connection to the brain comes back to the nervous system. So we kind of have two states of our nervous system. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it, but we have the parasympathetic, which is like rest, digest, and sympathetic, fight or flight, which is kind of like all the rage right now. I feel like everyone's like talking about this.
Yeah.
But one thing that people don't mention quite as much is with that sympathetic nervous system response, which is what's happening in your body when you're like, for example, experiencing anxiety. Your body basically shuts down digestion, because if you're thinking of what that kind of system is meant for, it's meant for situations when we're being threatened. And
right.
usually like it's, you know, like classically it's like life-threatening situation. Yeah. Like people always are like, oh, a tiger's chasing you. That's everyone's favorite example.
Yes.
But in that situation, you know, like you're not going to be eating and digesting food.
Right.
And so when you shift into that sympathetic response, it shuts off your ability to make hydrochloric acid and digestive enzymes and all the things that you need to digest your food. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times, like underproduction of stomach acid can lead to those overgrowths in the gut microbiome. Okay. Not being able to break down nutrients because you don't have digestive enzymes can lead to mental health repercussions, because there's certain proteins and amino acids that we need in order to make neurotransmitters. So a lot of times when we're living chronically in that response, it can really affect our nutrition, our gut and our body's ability to actually like use and break down the foods that we are eating. Right. So it kind of then from there turns into a vicious cycle, because that nervous system overreaction kind of creates an environment where all the bad things that we don't want to happen in our gut start happening. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's super, again, I find that, I think like recording this podcast came at like the perfect time for me too. And I didn't realize like how many people that follow me were also experiencing similar things. But just like, exactly what you just explained also connects to the idea of like your body. There's nothing wrong with your body. Like it would make sense that if you are in your fight or flight, like your body's going to do everything it can for you. It's for you, but it's not necessarily be what feels good.
Yes. It's trying to survive. And that's what it thinks it has to do. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And I like, it's nice to hear like the science behind that too, because I think when you can have like we talked about before we recorded, like if you can have the logical understanding, and then also, use, when it comes to like calming anxiety or like working your body through things, that's often coming from more of a place of emotion. So I feel like when you compare those two, like, it allows for so much more empathy when you're in a process of healing your body, which is really nice.
Yeah. And also knowing like how intercorrelated those two are. So if you're working on one, like you're indirectly working on the other one too, which is always kind of a nice reminder.
Yeah. Well, and so kind of another question I have around that. So I mean, just across the board, I think feeling often anxious and overwhelmed, especially for young people, is very common. And I didn't really realize, honestly, until I started deep diving more of your stuff, like how much, reasonably so, that's going to affect what's going on in your gut. And so how can you, for someone that's like that struggles with anxiety or overwhelm specifically, like they often find themselves in that fight or flight, and are probably noticing, myself and people listening, inflammation or nausea, what can they do to remedy that?
From like specifically like nutrition standpoint?
Yeah. Because obviously there's like, breath work, meditation for the mental, but yeah, as far as in the gut.
Yeah, so I think like what comes to mind with that is, kind of, I guess, two-part is one, if you're having like gut health symptoms, whether that's like bloating all the time or like loose stool or constipation, or all of those are like the same that I would think you would say anxiety is your body trying to tell you something. Like that's also an imbalance. Your body's trying to tell you something is off. So I think a lot of times those things get normalized, or doctors will just be like, take a laxative or what have you. And those are like signs that something is off. So I think like easiest things that are kind of like broad spectrum in that situation, would be focusing on eating warm foods. They're easier to digest.
Warm
foods.
Interesting.
So they're easier to digest. Like for example, raw vegetables are really challenging to digest and break down. But also cold foods can almost like bring your nervous system back into that like fight or flight state more easily than warm foods. So I always am like telling people like soups, stews, if you're doing vegetables, like lots of cooked vegetables, stuff like that. I would say there's a lot around eating hygiene for this group of people. A lot of times, especially if you're like overwhelmed or on the go or, that type of personality,
and when you're anxious, you're often also looking for like quick dopamine cures. So you're like,
exactly,
ice cream, cookies, whatever.
Yeah. So I'll touch on that actually after, because I just thought of something with that. But focusing on like when you're eating meals, like take a few deep breaths before, because that can help you shift into that parasympathetic state. And like people kind of, I think, laugh at that a lot, but it does help a lot. Yeah. Another one is actually chewing your food. A lot of times we're on the go, we're rushing, or we're just like, we're watching TV or scrolling while eating. And so we barely chew. And so like all of those things are going to like contribute to those symptoms and issues that you're dealing with. I would say like, obviously like there's a time and place when working with a professional is, the next step, but those are all definitely things to focus on. The other thing that I want to touch on too with like kind of the nervous system and anxiety pieces.
A quick question before you hop into that. As far as like working with a professional, I think like a lot of like the worry for a lot of young people is just like the financial aspect of that. Are there nutritionists that can like be covered by insurance? Like, can you do that in a way that's covered by insurance?
There are some, I will say, like, if you're going the insurance route, I would just check kind of their background, their education, because this is more of like an integrative functional approach. And a lot of those that take insurance won't practice that way.
It's not going to be as mind body, most likely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, be aware of, I guess, that, just like knowing that going into it. But yeah.
Yeah, but I also imagine, like, I know it's not super fun to like hop into all of the like having to do it self-guided if you don't feel like you can afford to work with a coach. But I think there are like a lot of free resources out there. I feel like if you can find someone like you that makes videos on it, like you can start there. And like what we talked about, where it's like, just pick 2 things, like make it really simple. You don't need to, spend weeks and months like diving into this and becoming an expert. Like you can just make little baby tweaks.
And on that note too, I think a lot of people like jump to the fancy stuff first, like jump to working with a coach or having stool testing done or taking the supplement they saw on TikTok. And I'm like, if you're not focused on the foundations, like you shouldn't jump to that, because if you're not giving your body everything that it needs, just like standard baseline without having any issues, like even if you jump into one of those types of treatments, like you're either going to have to work with someone, they're going to tell you to do those things, hopefully, or you're not going to get the results that you actually want, because you don't have that like strong, resilient foundation.
Right.
So that's what I was going to touch on with like the nervous system piece, is that I think a lot of times people experience anxiety due to, one, not eating enough calories. I see that all the time, especially with women. I would say like majority of my clients, especially like in the morning. I would say 2 is
the granola bar grab.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally exactly what I was going to say.
Girl breakfast.
Girl breakfast, or having a giant coffee for breakfast. That's a recipe for feeling anxious and low energy throughout the day. And don't even get me started on the gut, repercussions there. So that's a huge one. And I do think that for a majority of people, making sure that you kind of like front protein in the first meal of the day, especially if you're more anxious, focusing on that is really helpful. Like I see that's one of the first things that I do with a lot of my clients, and the shifts that they see just from making that switch are huge. So I think like just doing those simple shifts can go a long way for a lot of people, because if you're not, you're not giving your body, for example, like the protein, like we need amino acids to make serotonin and dopamine. So if you don't have enough of those, like it's going to be really hard for, your mood to be good.
Yeah. And it's funny because like I also recently made that switch a few months ago where I was eating oats and stuff for breakfast, which was fine, but I had previously been doing that because I was marathon training, so I was going for a run first thing in the morning, so I needed that. But then I continued it when I stopped, and I was I am unwell. And so then I moved to like eating like avocado toast and like eggs or like a few pieces of bacon or something, and I feel so much better. And it's very interesting, just like the simplest of things. Yeah, I think that's like, we miss the low-hanging fruit a lot, I think, in the nutrition space, especially with social media and seeing people's like crazy wellness routines, and it can make it feel like it's impossible, but like most people don't need all of those things to be healthy and to feel well. So I would definitely just say like you could make it a long way with free content, and with just focusing on those baseline foundations, you know? And I had heard you mention in another podcast that like one of the core things too that can really help is just eating a wider range of fruits and vegetables, which is actually, again, you'd think it would be common sense, and I was reflecting on myself where I was like, I eat the same. I'll eat like strawberries, green beans, carrots, just like the same wheel of maybe like 6 things every week. But that being said, I'm not someone that just like loves vegetables. I have such a hard time. Like, do you have any like resources as far as like recipes or like what people can do so that they are eating a wider range of fruits and vegetables? Especially vegetables, because I'm an infant. I'm so, it's so dumb. I just like, and like a salad is, like I can't.
Well, I will say salads aren't going to be the best for if you are having
I guess because you're saying warm food.
I definitely have a lot of people who are like, I'm so bloated every afternoon, and I'm like, what are you eating for lunch? And they're like, a huge salad. But okay, I have a lot to say on that topic.
Because I bet you experience that with clients. They're like, you like eat more range of vegetables or whatever, and they're like,
I don't want to. Do you consider yourself like a picky eater in general?
No, I just like, I feel like I haven't, honestly, I just feel like I need more like recipes or ways that I can incorporate vegetables.
Gotcha.
Because when it's like, I don't know, if I can incorporate it into something, I like it. Like most vegetables I do actually like, I just like don't have the recipes I feel like that make it good.
Gotcha.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, what I say is to most people, I'm like, if people don't like vegetables, it's probably because they're not cooking them right. Like, that's what I say. Like, which is kind of mean, but but I do think that there's epidemic of cooking green vegetables till they're brown in our society.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think one cool, like, easy way to incorporate, like, a variety of vegetables is doing, like, things like soups or stews or curries. Because
curry's a good idea. I like curry.
Like, one, like, you can buy, like, a curry paste that's, like, literally just, like, spices at the grocery store, like, pretty easy. Like, other ingredients, you're, like, whatever protein you want, some rice, coconut milk probably, and then you could just throw whatever vegetables in there. Like, honestly, like, just depending on what's going on, like, you're not going to want to do lettuces, but whatever seasonal, you know, produce might be is kind of gonna fit. So I like that because I think a lot of people like curry, and it's also something that meal preps really well because it tends to, like, you know, get better as it sits in the fridge. So that and, like, other, like, soups I definitely, like, will do a lot of. I think just general rule of thumb, most people cook their vegetables on too low of heat. So, like, if you think about, like, cauliflower sucks if you cook it on, like, 300 or 350 degrees.
Yeah.
But if you cook it on, like, 450, it, like, starts to caramelize. It, like, has a completely different texture.
Yeah.
So always, like, thinking about or, like, playing around with, like, what temperature you're cooking vegetables at, because a lot need, like, need some, like, care or at least consideration. Like, zucchini is another one. Like, zucchini's slimy, right?
Yeah.
But if you just, like, if you have, like, a pan on, like, high enough heat and you throw it in there, you just get color on one side, it still has some bite. So, like, thinking about, like, okay, like, how does this vegetable, like, want to be cooked? I'm like, me and my boyfriend always talk, like, vegetables, like, each one has a way that it shines.
Right.
So it's, like, learning, like, okay, how does this shine?
Yeah.
Which I don't know if that's, like, super helpful, but just those were some examples.
Yeah. No. Yeah. It's very helpful.
I think another, like, one for the diversity piece is I love doing, like, green herby sauces. So think, like, you can do, you know, like a chimichurri type of vibe and do, like, parsley, cilantro, and oregano. Throw it in your food processor. You just have to add, like, garlic and lemon and some chili flakes, olive oil. But that's already, like, okay, like, that's 5 plant foods, right?
Yeah.
That you could have every day for a week if you made a big batch.
Yeah.
And then you're, like, kind of naturally, like, okay, if you're adding that onto 1 or 2 vegetables, you're, like, kind of slowly, like, stacking. So I always remind people, like, herbs and spices count into that diversity. Nuts, seeds, grains all count into that diversity. So it's kind of, like, getting creative with it. I don't know if that helped.
Yeah. No. It's really helpful just because it's, like, it feels very discouraging when you're trying to, like, eat a wider variety of vegetables and all you're really doing is just, like, slapping a spoonful of vegetables, like, cooked vegetables on your plate, and it's just like,
yeah, you're like
unless it's the ones that I
excited.
like, it's like that I, like, particularly like to eat that way. It's a little bit rough, so I would prefer, like you said, to have a way where I can work it in more.
Yeah. Cover it up a little.
Yeah. Well, and so, like, with fruits, is there... Well, actually, with both, is there... Well, actually, I'll just say fruits. Okay. Is there a better time of day to be eating fruits, since they are, like, it can, like... Can't it, like, up your blood sugar?
Everyone, you will get a different answer from, like, every nutrition professional on this.
But I guess it would depend on lifestyle as well. Maybe.
It would depend, like, a lot on, like, kind of what you're going for, what your goals are. So I'll just, like, say what I would say for your audience specifically. Yeah. I would probably pair them, like, with a meal or have them after a meal. A lot of times when someone is struggling with, like, anxiousness or even, like, low energy, it can sometimes be due to blood sugar dysregulation.
Right.
So a lot of times having, like, a carbohydrate, like a fruit, on an empty stomach, or alone can sometimes, like, cause a little bit of dysregulation or cravings later, things like that. So if you're really trying to, like, stay steady and stable throughout the day, I'd probably either have it with that meal, after the meal, or, like, pair it with, you know, if you have an apple, have a couple slices of cheese or something with it to, like, kind of, like, balance that out. Just, like, basically I say make snacks mini meals, so you have all those components, it's just a smaller amount.
And what are your thoughts on, like, another question I have that connects to that is there's such, like, a thing in nutrition where people either talk about like little meals throughout the day, or like you should hit like your 3 main meals. Like, do you do anything in specific with that, or is that like person based? What are your thoughts on that?
I personally think that that's person based and goal based. So sometimes with like there's particular conditions within the gut that people really need a break in between meals. So having those 3 larger meals and not eating in between is really beneficial. But there's you know, definitely some validity to if someone is like dealing with a lot of stress and anxiety, that having more frequent meals throughout the day can be beneficial for some people. And then there's kind of like the whole hormone piece. A lot of women find that they do really well eating within 30 minutes of waking up, especially if you're like currently have a menstrual cycle. So there's...
I actually didn't even know that. That's really interesting. I usually like wait a few hours.
Yeah, so it's funny because I get a lot of questions about like intermittent fasting and all that, because you see so much content on that.
Because I don't even do it like to fast. I'm just like, I'm not hungry, you know? Yeah.
That is sometimes hormone related, sometimes gut related. I mean, sometimes it can be a lot of different pieces there, but I have found that a lot of women feel that they do best with having that kind of like high protein breakfast within 30 minutes of waking. So I think with that, it is a lot listening to your body.
Yeah.
And also knowing that the way you eat might change at different phases in your life.
Yeah,
you might, you know, feel like, okay, I had 3 meals a day and that's been my thing for 5 years, and all of a sudden you're like, I kind of need snacks. Like, that's fine.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I think we get stuck in like, this is what worked, so this is what will always work. But like, that's not always the case.
Yeah.
So
or usually ever the case.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
less than often. So yeah, I think that definitely varies.
Okay. That's very helpful. Well, okay, another question on that. Are you supposed to are you supposed to be hungry when you wake up? Like, are you supposed to want to eat? I don't know.
I would say, I mean, not everyone wakes up like starving. Like, I wouldn't say like if you're not waking up starving that you like need to worry. But if it's like very easy for you to, like, say you ate dinner at 6 and you wake up at 6, just to make math easy, and you aren't wanting to eat until like 10, sometimes I think that could be a sign of like skewed hunger signals, and sometimes that's due to stress, and sometimes it's due to hormones.
Interesting.
Yeah, so just something I guess to be aware of more than anything. But you definitely want that natural like hunger coming in the morning, especially as a woman.
Yeah, because I mean that's sort of why I think with me particularly, usually what it is that I eat dinner too late. Later than I probably should be eating dinner. So then like it takes some time after I wake up for me to like actually feel any sort of hunger. Yeah,
and if like say you were eating dinner at like 8:30 or 9 and then you get hungry at like 9:30, 10 like the next morning, like that seems pretty normal to me.
Yeah.
Like, like I wouldn't be as like, that's strange, So I also do find though a lot of times when we work on eating earlier in the day with clients that after a while those hunger cues do come back. So it's kind of something that you can train too.
Is it not good to eat too close before you go to sleep? Like, is that what is there digestion stuff with that?
I would say a lot of people do better when they eat an earlier dinner.
Yeah.
And have that time to kind of digest prior to sleep, because it can kind of affect your sleep.
I feel like I am that way. I just like don't do it.
Yeah. I think that's like a lot of people. It's not
I grew
like
up in a family where like we ate dinner at like 8 or 9 pretty much every night.
Yeah, so it's probably just normal for you.
So, but I feel better, like you're saying, if I eat it a little sooner.
Yeah. I would say most people feel better that way. I would say sometimes if people have like blood sugar dysregulation, they need kind of like a higher protein snack closer to bedtime to make it through the night, because sometimes if you're having that dysregulation, you can have a dip in the middle of the night.
What would a snack like that look like?
Kind of like the mini meal concept. So it could be like, you know.
Like, what are good high protein snacks?
I usually go for like a jerky of some kind, or like a couple slices of turkey, or, you know, like that type of, you could have some cottage cheese if you're into that. And then like a little like side of fruit, or one that I'll use for a lot of clients with if they need kind of that snack, is doing like collagen protein in some type of tea or drink, because it's just easy.
Yeah. That's
that's like one of like, I'm not, it's an easy way to like incorporate more protein when you need it, because it's just like, oh, powder, I can put this in a liquid.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
Yeah. Which might not be like as perfect as like a whole food, but like you're doing it.
It's better than not doing it.
Exactly.
If it's something that you need.
Yeah.
So yeah, finding those like little like hacks and tricks, because it's hard to like eat whole foods all the time. You know, like it's a lot of work.
Yeah. Especially, I feel like for somebody, because like I think it's easier for you or I, because we work from home, or like we work remotely. So if someone doesn't have a flexible schedule, I feel like it'd be pretty tough.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot easier when you work from home.
Yeah.
So it's a lot more work and planning and prep if you're like going into the office every day, because it's like, okay, what's your lunch? Like, what's your dinner going to be when you get home? All those like logistics and stuff. So
yeah. Because I think this is also something people talk about a lot, is trying to figure out if you maybe have some sort of like allergy or intolerance to food. How would you go about, like, I think a lot of people think that they might, but they're not really sure. How do you go about doing that? Like, is there a schedule where it's like you take it out for like 3 months, and like, I don't know, like how do you pinpoint?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say on this. So one thing I always mention is that I think a lot of people like jump to thinking I'm intolerant to some type of food, and I would say more often than not, it's probably something going on in the gut microbiome that's causing an intolerance to the food.
Interesting.
So I'll answer the question about like eliminating foods and stuff first, just to like cover that and then kind of expand. But with like eliminating certain foods, typically like I'll start with like a month of removing said foods. So like we'll just use dairy as an example, because it's a common one. I think people think that they have.
Is it true that most people have issues with dairy? Is that a thing?
There's a
lot of people say that. They're like, people aren't supposed to be having like cow's milk. Like, I feel like I hear that a lot.
My personal belief is that a lot of it has to do with the dairy industry and how animals are treated and how like we process dairy.
The process of it.
And a lot of those animals have hormones and antibiotics, which can really affect our health. And so for me, as someone like who has been sensitive to dairy in the past, I found that the quality of dairy is a big part of it.
Which like, you think that's like common sense, because I think about like if I eat something like ice cream or like a good quality like cottage cheese or something, like I'll be fine with that. But if I eat like some sort of, also there's like processed sugars in there,